to welcome everybody to this second day of our conference, and I want to thank you, the committee, the organizing committee of this conference, for being so, to invite me to present the first plenary speaker of today, Professor Francesc Torralba, who's here with me at this table, who is going to gift us this the privilege of talking about his theories. I'm not going to lengthen my speech a lot because words are needed to present Professor Torralba, as his curriculum itself speaks volumes of his experience. Professor Torralba is professor of ethics at University in Barcelona, multiple doctor, shall we say, in philosophy, theology, history, and art, and lately in the area of pedagogy, like his doctoral thesis around the methodology thinking and Stein's thought. Francesc Torralba's thought is ample, it's wide. It can be seen in his several numbers of articles and research, and merges mainly with the areas of philosophical anthropology and it's splitting, it's leading the path to the ethics of the human being that comes from a personalist experience, and it's related to the classical thought. And due to his ample path, it's been spread to several questions of different the nature of human being, the sense of its like their life, death. All of this has an impact, like Professor Torralba's thought has an impact that led him take charge of different positions in prestigious institutions. He's been named by the Pope as representative of culture, and also he counts on like several awards in the fields of arts. So for us, it's a privilege to count on him. And with your presence here, bom dia, buenos dias. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a privilege for us. I want to greet Professor Mariano for the translation in his new book. This is a very difficult translation, and I look forward to reading it. Thank you for the invitation and for all the organization.
Thank you very much for coming. I would like to speak in Spanish. I will speak slowly to facilitate the work to the translators. I would like to speak about the purpose of education in Einstein's philosophy. The first time I will clarify some concepts, and the second part I will to speak.
Para facilitar la labor del traductor, está introduciendo el tema de su conferencia.
That is what I want to do this meeting, And thank you very much. If you have any question, I would like to answer after my speech.
Si después hay preguntas en inglés,
Bien, voy
él
a
mismo puede
tratar
responderlas.
de explicar en primer lugar lo que me propongo.
Well, in this conference, we propose to expose, as it is shown in the title, that we are going to summarize in a systematic way the notion of building in a Wittgenstein's philosophy. That word building had a bad translation in another languages. It is normally translated as education, probably as the paideia they used the Greek people. So we are going to try to clarify the real meaning of this word. So Wittgenstein uses the word building in different pedagogical works. It is key at first clarification. Stein uses three terms to try to describe this concept. These three terms refer to different things. Both of them refer to education, but we are going to try to clarify exactly the term of building. Stein is really interested in clarifying the use of the words to understand the real concept. For her, it's very important to clarify the terms she's using. At that point, she shares the same goal that Wittgenstein. She never cited him, but they share the same idea. This Stein's approach deserves special attention. Training does not consist in taking on external knowledge, nor having encyclopedic knowledge. It is not about storing an enormous amount of data, but about a person acquiring his or her own configuration. The same interest in clarifying concepts was shared by our writer Ortega y Gasset. So my purpose in this conference is to try to clarify the concept that Wittgenstein has about the concept building. An idea about the building concept is that she's especially interested in clarify this concept in the places where they teach teachers when the training is being the main act.
en algunas universidades católicas, pontificias o de inspiración cristiana, pero por lo general se ignora profundamente su pensamiento pedagógico, su
I think it is a pity that the concept of building it's something that it is ignored in many faculties and in many universities, and it can really light the life of teachers and professors and educators.
por tanto mi interés no es únicamente conceptual,
So my main interest here is not just to clarify the concept, but to try that the Wittgenstein's idea of education have this idea in their minds.
dicho eso, empiezo por mirar de clarificar Bildung, por lo tanto esta noción de formación en nuestra lengua.
So let's see the concept of building in Wittgenstein's works.
¿Qué no es la Bildung?
First of all, let's try to clarify what's not building.
Cito ya el primer texto, es un texto de 1931, Grundlagen der Frauenbildung, los fundamentos de la formación de la mujer. La formación no es la posesión de conocimiento.
She assures that building it's not to have knowledge.
No es albergar un conocimiento enciclopédico. O cuanto menos no es solo eso.
At least it's not just this. The ideal of training, as it was in the Latin ages, was the idea of encyclopedic knowledge, as complete as possible. The usual idea of the soul as a tabula rasa on which the teacher must write the knowledge by intellectual understanding and mnemonic techniques. From the worldview of the Enlightenment movement, an educated person is a being who has been trained in different disciplines, in the science of nature and in the science of the spirit, who has an encyclopedic knowledge as complete as possible, who has traveled all over the world and who knows the most distant and ignored cultural traditions of civilization. Stein goes beyond this. For Stein's works, the building, the education has to do essentially with the process of shaping the human personality through a set of external and internal forces. Far from the enlightened idea of knowledge. It enlightened the idea of shaping. About this idea of shaping something, to shape a being which is not complete, a being which is in process. But in any case, it's not just knowledge. In the way of shaping that being, some forces intervene, external and internal forces. I want to result something that is repeated in all the works. It is an infinitive process. So we are always shaping, we are always forming ourselves. Even the teacher, it's not a completely educated person. We can't use the idea of completed thing, completed being. It is also a being which is still receiving training, but he has been many times before training, and that's what gives him the right to try to educate others. But the learner is not in process while the teacher is formed. Both are continuously formed along their lives. Training is always an infinitive process. We are always receiving exterior and interior forces that are shaping us. So we saw that educate is to shape someone. This is an infinitive process, and there is a third idea. It is a process which goal is that that person becomes to be what is called to be. That's the concept of vocation. We will talk later about it. So the goal of educate is get that learner be what he is called to be. Someone calls to be you something, and that someone is God. So in order to reach that called person, you have to relive in the community. The community is going to be key, a key element. Nowadays, the word vocation has mainly disappeared, and sometimes the term vocation provokes reactions against that. Maybe because it means that someone is calling you to something, and that refers to the idea of God. Sometimes at different time refer this to mission, called or mission. For Edith Stein is God who calls the learner. There's another concept that I want to point. She thinks that educate a person is to develop his potency in order he became to be not potency but act. This is an Aristotelic idea. the potency against act. For Einstein, educate a human being means identify his potencies and then try him to develop and get them to plenitude. This is a process. This is not an immediate thing. It requires a very important thing, that is time. This is important to resolve this because in this society, when things go really very fast, we have to take into account that time is a thing that is required, something that is necessary. Relation time, time between teacher and learner. Einstein understands the idea of training from the point of view of the art, something that is made with your hands, like a potter who is working in clay. When Einstein talks about education, she doesn't distinguish between interior or exterior education. She understands that education must be integral. Edith Steins affirm that the education has to do with the interiority of the human being as well as the exteriority of that human being. Both body and soul are in a process of formation. The body needs material things to grow. That exterior materials makes the body grows. But in the interior dimension, you also need external materials. Sometimes we think in education in a very reductive way. We think only in the physical way or just mainly in the cognitive way. Indeed, both are related. The interior formation, the interior education is so important as the exterior one. So the education is integral or it isn't. It has to take into account all the different dimensions of the person. All the capacities have to be developed. If you focus in body, you forget the interior aspect. Both Stein thinks that both aspects has to be developed.
En cualquier caso, la formación es, último punto de definiciones que doy, es ese proceso cuyo fin es el crecimiento de la persona, en todos los sentidos de la palabra crecimiento.
So we can conclude that for Edith Stein, education is grow in all the possible dimensions of the person.
Dar forma. De hecho, formar tiene que ver con introducir una forma.
So relating the term educating with the relation with the term shaping a form,
Pero tiene límites.
we can think in the image of a potter.
Es la imagen del alfarero.
The image of a potter is useful to understand the meaning of this notion in a first approach, but only in a first approach. The potter shapes a block of clay. With his hands, he chisels a form that, in the end, becomes a sculptor. But in order to reach that form, he has had to train for a period of time. The metaphor is meaningful, but not exact, because the learner is not a passive subject, not an inert substance. This is the same idea that Platon develops.
Tratando de dar forma al mundo, a imagen de un mundo ideal. Lo que pasa es que como el demiurgo es un dios menor, no construye o da forma de un modo perfecto.
But indeed, the learner is not something inert. He is someone and not something, a subject and not an object.
La imagen es valiosa, pero tiene límites.
In him, in the learner, there is a hidden individual form, so that the potter cannot give him the form that he arbitrarily decides, but must discover that internal latent form to externalize it with his work.
Implícito o explícito, pero quien forma, da forma a la luz de un modelo. Y el modelo para Stein es Cristo.
So
El modelo para Stein es
the potter must use the clay to be formed
el educador
as a model.
cuando se dispone a formar a un ser humano. Podría ser otro, ciertamente, pero para formar es indispensable un modelo.
In order to form, it is clearly necessary to know what it is going to be formed.
El modelo al infinito.
For Edith Stein, the model is Christ.
De imitar a ese modelo
The model, Christ, cannot be imitated, but there must be a will to be very close to the model.
imperfecta. Y Stein lo expresa. ¿Por qué? Porque el alfarero se encuentra con una materia que es una materia bruta, una materia primera.
As the potter works with a material which has not a vocation, the metaphor is useful but not exactly.
El educando no es una tabula rasa.
Learner is not something that we can consider a tabula rasa.
Que se va configurando según la forma del educador. Sino hay una forma interior en ese
The learner has an interior form,
que de algún modo el que educa debe extraerla.
and the teacher has to extract from him.
Que salga afuera y que adquiera volumen. Lo cual significa que no es un proceso donde hay una realidad inerte que va configurando, sino que se trata también
It's only possible to create a form if there is an original image, an archetype or original form.
de toda su identidad del mundo. Por lo tanto, su individualidad, su singularidad.
The mission of formation is as it has been said, twofold, both exterior and interior. But, as we will see, the center of gravity is, above all, the soul of the person, the most nuclear and essential of the human person. Forming a human being is, in fact, to give form to his soul, to shape his personality. This activity is the most profound of all those that can be carried out with a human being, and the one that can really bring about a substantive change in his being. So the image of the former and the clay must be complete with another. Must be complete with the idea that the material we are working is a alive being. And Stein says, and complete the image, adding that all deformation is auto-formation.
Desarrollar áreas o comprensiones que por mí misma no alcanzo. Por eso dice que sí, en la formación hay fuerzas exteriores e interiores, hay una dimensión voluntaria e involuntaria, pero en ese entorno uno es capaz de elegir lo que quiere leer, a quien quiere seguir, lo que quiere explorar a fondo para seguir creciendo. Eso significa también capacidad crítica, capacidad de discernimiento, que es lo que se le supone al educando en un determinado momento de su desarrollo vital.
The first forces are physical realities that oppose resistance. The second are elements of the spiritual movement, values, beliefs, ideals, works of art that humanity has elaborated over centuries. Formation must always be at the service of the ultimate vocation of the human being. It cannot be correctly interpreted without attending to this double plane of his reflection. In addition to the strictly immanent forces of a material and spiritual order, there is the transcendent force that acts on the person and that can, unlike the immanent forces, transcend the frontiers of nature and transform the person entirely. It is To say it more easily, God can activate the human being capacities and competencies that are not in his given nature. He can work miracles in him.
La formación humana, que es la que nosotros podemos hacer, tiene límites. Tiene límites. Y Stein analiza muy a fondo estos límites, estas fronteras. ¿Por qué? Porque la formación tiene en primer lugar un límite que es el
The environment is given to the person, and in it there are possibilities, but also needs, limitations, and deficiencies. Education requires the outside, but also the inside. For the process of formation to take place, the person must work on himself and open himself to the material and immaterial environment in order to nourish himself with the elements that are in it. Even so, he must distinguish between what is valuable, noble, and beautiful for his inner growth, and what is harmful and toxic to his being, both from the material and immaterial point of view.
Hay materiales que permiten una ductilidad, que permiten un desarrollo de materiales que no lo permiten. Pero en cualquier caso, es fundamental reconocer el primer límite, el educando. Que es límite y condición de posibilidad, porque si no existe la formación. Como aquello de la palabra kantiana. Bueno, el aire es resistencia, pero es condición de posibilidad. Si no,
Edith Stein writes, "The free person holds himself in his hands, that is, soul and body are under the direction of the will, although not unconditionally. Man can take from the surrounding environment the nourishment available for body and soul, and he can choose what is appropriate and reject what is harmful, but he can also renounce this. He can neglect himself, and consequently, he can blame himself if he remains uneducated or malformed. But we saw also that he is not the only responsible for this. On the one hand, he cannot do for himself what he wills. Limits are imposed on his rational will by his natural constitution. If he goes beyond them, if he is not happy with what is determined for him, then there is no authentic formation, but a fictitious formation, an external appearance. Formation is therefore, in the last analysis, self-responsibility. The teacher activates from the outside the formative process, but the learner can renounce to be formed and remain in the state of non-formation. It will depend on him. However, there are natural and environmental boundaries, which are far from the freedom of the person and which are imposed on him, even against his will. To the extent that all formation includes an internal configuration and at the same time an external configuration, it is integral growth, because through it the person not only grows physically but also interiorly, because progressively he becomes more fully what he is called to be, progressively reaches his formal and material fullness. The first and fundamental shaping occurs from the inside. As in the germ of plants there is hidden an inner form, an invisible force that causes a pine tree grow, being a pine and not a beech tree. So is hidden in the human being an inner form that leads to his development in a certain direction and develops a personality with a completely defined individual peculiarity.
Y es algo que a veces olvidamos en sociedades hiperindividualistas. Que el proceso
To
formativo
illustrate her philosophical conception of building, Wittgenstein uses an agrarian simile, an agrarian comparison. In the seed of the plant, there is an inner form that gives that being a direction.
a lo largo del tiempo acompañan a ese educando.
Depending on what that inner form is like, the seed will become an oak, a beech, or a walnut tree. But in order for it to become what it is inside, it requires an environment, a moist soil with certain mineral substances. It needs rain and oxygen, but it also needs the protection and care of a gardener to watch over its being and protect it from disintegrating forces in its first stage. It is clear then that the gardener, a simile of the sharper, does not imprint any external or artificial form on the being he's forming. His objective is to ensure what this being can manifest the internal form that is in him, wherever it be that of oak, beech, or walnut. From this reflection, we can assure that, according to the thinker, the human being is not a tabula rasa, but a being that points at a certain direction. There is, then, according to her, a natural tendency that is oriented toward fullness, but the realization of this fullness depends on a constellation of variables and factors that are unconnected to the being of the person. The same applies to the simile of the seed and the tree. In the seed is inscribed a tendency that will lead it to become a beech or an oak. But it can only become a beech or an oak if the conditions for its full development are present. The internal needs the external to make its way. It needs the earth, the water and the air, but the external by itself cannot guarantee the formative process, because it must be able to act on something previously given. As mentioned in the introduction, Edith Stein's thought has a philosophical and theological dimensions. At the center is man, created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore with an inviolable interior life, which is the root of his dignity and the sacred space of the encounter with him. Formation must always be at the service of the ultimate vocation of the human being inscribed in his nature. Edith Stein writes, "There is only one shaping power which, unlike those mentioned before, is not bound to the limits of nature, but can transform the inner shape from within, the power of grace. that can transform from the inside the learner and change what should be the destiny of someone.
Aquí parte de una idea que naturalmente es muy discutida por filósofos de la educación, de que todo ser humano nace para desarrollar un determinado objetivo, propósito. Hay un expect, un fin, una finalidad determinada. Otra cosa es que no sea capaz de identificarla, reconocerla, o simplemente no sea capaz de auscultarla, pero en cualquier caso, somos seres llamados.
This way of interpreting building is linked to the original Greek meaning of paideia.
Esa llamada no solo es una llamada que a veces leemos de un modo
As is well known, paideia was not only the content of education, not the various stages that people had to overcome to complete the educational process. The paideia was much more. It was an internal process of self-awareness in which the person was taught to know his strengths and weaknesses and the capabilities and limitations of every human being. And from telling foundational stories that had to be learned by heart and strong discipline, he was prepared to seek wisdom and could become thus a citizen of the polis and belong to a collective entity that gave identity and meaning to the lives of individuals. The paideia was an ideal of culture.
Lo que pasa es que para poder desarrollarla necesitará convivir una comunidad. Supongamos que esta niña se siente llamada a curar a personas, a convertirse en médico. Es su vocación, que luego se convierte en pasión y en veruf, en profesión, como el árbol se convierte en veruf. Pero para alcanzar ese objetivo necesita de una verdadera comunidad de personas que le ayuden también en sus momentos de debilidad, de contradicción, de flaqueza, a persistir en esa vocación.
So learners need the community to complete a vocation.
Formar también es ayudar al autoconocimiento. Formar es que esa persona se conozca. Conozca para qué está hecha. El bochulo. El bochule, ¿para qué vives? ¿Cuál es el objetivo? El propósito. El fin. Y eso requiere un tipo de intervención educativa que está muy lejana de nuestros horizontes habituales. Lo esencial está pues, en el qué o en el cómo que enseñar la materia o cómo enseñar. Pero ¿y el para qué? ¿Para qué enseñamos? Pues enseñamos para que ese ser humano identifique para qué está hecho y que pueda llevarlo a término. Porque ahí está la base de su plenitud. Que pueda vivir conforme a esa vocación, conforme a esa llamada. Entonces aquí lo subrayo porque ahí es donde introduce la cuestión teológica. Yo creo que entre las fuentes de inspiración de la teología para la filosofía de la educación de Stein, además naturalmente de Santa Teresa, y por supuesto de su maestro y mentor Helmut Husserl, fue probablemente San Agustín. De modo que ella parte de la idea, lo veremos, que en el fondo de ese selbst, o de ese autor, está Dios.
In the depth of this selves, of these autos, is God, deep inside, in the Grund, in the Hintergrund. Behind this foundation of Grund is God, and God calls you. Another thing is the answer, the Antworten. I can answer or not. but God calls. So you develop a task, a vocation, a mission, with the time that you have given. You don't know when the mission will be, how long, short, long. God is the inner master. We think of St. Augustine. God teaches from inside. The truth. Don't go outside. Go inside. Inside is where truth lives. The colloquium St. Augustine. I'm going to show you a couple of fragments that will illustrate this and express it like more clearly. The first one in respect to individuality. This text is from 1926. The individuality is the last mystery that no man can penetrate completely. She uses the term geheimlich. It's also used by Jung when he talks about the mystery. God, the mystery of the world, is the last mystery that no man can penetrate, not even himself. Somehow, God knows us better than we can ever know ourselves, ever. It is Saint Augustus, the Saint Teresa. This is Saint Benedict of the Cross. Continue with the quotation. To reach this completely is an absurd task. The limits that our teaching task is subjected to is where we can get. We see it colloquially like teachers. We do what we can. In the classroom, we do what we can. They come as they come, and we work with that. I wish they came as, but we do what we can. We have limits, and she continues. We spread the seed. You see, this image, like New Testament. We don't know if it's like in rocky land or in good soil. And what makes it grow is God. And in the original text, we have it in italics. God. God is who makes the seed grow. It's a theology of education. The human being who educates does a preparatory job. Somehow, we prepare the soil. Somehow, we help the school takes the vocation, but we call. We must create the conditions. So, a school to call. And if we hear this call, we know what they've been born for. And this is what he says, what St. Augustine says. So the teacher who's in the room teaches from outside, but the inner magister teaches from the inside. The magister exterior says the educator meets the inner teacher. So they realize that they have been called to develop a task called by God. So this teacher knows where he's going. They will need help, support, but we can't determine their vocation, but just to help. Parents can't determine the vocation of the children, the purpose, the why. We must guide them, lead them. So this vocation acquires volume and reality, even if it's not what we had imagined for them. But teach is not translate to our children or frustrated desires and wishes. It is not. You have to get where I didn't get. You have to achieve where I failed. You have to develop your vocation, and we will help you alongside a lot of work and a big number of educators. And I'm going to finish with a text that is very valuable, precious for this is what I'm talking about. It's a text from 1926, where we realize Einstein says education is the preparatory for the last text, humility. This is possible. It consists mainly to lead the general objective of education. We said that we had led the child through the straight path, whereas we should have brought him to the point where he could follow his vocation. So he renounces to his own will and leaves his life in the hands of God. At first sight, it seems as if he had renounced of individuality. At first sight, in no way there is this case. Because to develop this vocation does not represent the destruction of individuality, but its fulfillment. Because it's been created for one big goal. And therefore, we sustain this will, and that doesn't mean to renounce to individuality, but precisely to be carried to the fulfillment of this individuality. In the last stanza, it says in 32, in the text that hasn't been quoted yet, in last stanza, she says, this is the one who loves. He is the one who calls every human being for something they are called for. For something they're called for a completely personal way. Who calls is a person. And the subject called is also a person. In Heidegger, who calls is the being. But the being called is a person that has to develop and fulfill a project. So their life is authentic. But Einstein is not the being that calls, it's God that calls. And that call doesn't destroy individuality, but it calls you to be yourself. But to be yourself, you need the community, time, and this is the time that you've given me for this presentation. Thank you very much.